In the medieval world, the church did not simply guide your soul. It governed your every breath, your every fear, your every hope. From the early medieval centuries through the late feudal age, the church stood as the most influential institution in all of Europe. It owned vast territories, dictated social order, preserved literacy, defined justice, and determined what was considered truth. In a fractured world of warring nobles, famine, and plague, the church became the single unifying force, yet also the supreme instrument of control. Long before the invention of mechanical clocks, ordinary people measured their lives through the rhythms dictated by the church. Every day was structured by the ringing of bells, dawn prayer, midday mass, evening vespers. These bells governed when fields were plowed, when markets opened, and when rest was permitted. The calendar was equally dominated by sacred feasts, saints' days, and periods of fasting. A peasant might spend nearly one-third of the year obeying ecclesiastical rituals that halted or altered daily work. This created a psychological rhythm in which a person's sense of time, purpose, and identity flowed directly from church authority. Even royal decrees rarely competed with the power of the bell tower. Yet the church's influence extended far beyond the passing of hours. Every major event in your life required clerical approval. Baptism determined your spiritual identity from infancy, tying you to the church before you could speak. Marriage was not merely a social contract, but a sacred union overseen by priests, and without their blessing, your children could be declared illegitimate. In death, salvation depended entirely on church rites. Without proper burial and prayers, your soul was believed to wander in torment. This made priests indispensable gatekeepers of the afterlife itself, holding ultimate psychological power over every man and woman. But the church's authority reached even deeper into the laws that governed the living. The church maintained its own judicial system, independent of any king. These courts handled matters of marriage, morality, inheritance, blasphemy, and disputes involving clergy. A whispered accusation of heresy or sinful behavior could summon you before a bishop's tribunal. Penalties ranged from public humiliation to heavy fines, pilgrimages, or spiritual punishments that threatened your eternal fate. The church taught that sins, even private ones, had cosmic consequences. Thus, fear became a governing force. A villager might censor their own thoughts, terrified that unspoken doubt could damn them. Yet the greatest power of the church lay in the idea of salvation itself. Medieval sermons vividly describe the torments of hellfire, burning lakes, endless darkness, demonic torment, and eternal separation from God. To a population that rarely read Scripture, these images became truth. Between heaven and hell, the church introduced the doctrine of purgatory, a painful, purifying realm where most souls would suffer before entering paradise. This belief granted the church a critical instrument of influence, the ability to shorten or lengthen suffering through prayers, masses, and charitable giving. Wealthy families could buy relief for deceased relatives. The poor were left to hope. But fear was not the only method of control. Control also came through knowledge itself. For centuries, monasteries were the only places where reading and writing were preserved. Books were copied by hand, locked away inside scriptoria. The vast majority of the population, peasants, warriors, and even many nobles, never learned to read. This illiteracy made priests the interpreters of divine truth. They told people what Scripture said, what God demanded, what destiny awaited sinners or the faithful. Knowledge was not merely a privilege, it was a controlled substance dispensed only through clerical authority. And this monopoly over knowledge came with another overwhelming power, the power to declare what was forbidden. The church maintained lists of banned writings, condemning works considered heretical, magical, or contrary to doctrine. Owning such texts could lead to excommunication or public punishment. Preachers warned that curiosity itself could be a sin. Ordinary people learned to mistrust any knowledge not sanctioned by the church. This intellectual surveillance created a culture of obedience. Thinking beyond permitted boundaries became an act of rebellion, both dangerous and spiritually condemned. Yet perhaps the most tangible form of control was economic. Every household owed a tithe 1/10 of all harvests, livestock, or income to the church. Failure to pay was treated as both a legal crime and a spiritual offense. Monasteries and bishoprics owned enormous estates, making the church one of the largest landholders in medieval Europe. Many peasants labored on church-controlled fields, paying rents, fees, and additional tribute. This created an economic cycle in which spiritual authority translated directly into material wealth, and poverty reinforced obedience. To displease the church was to risk both earthly hardship and eternal peril. And the church's influence reached into the most intimate realm of medieval life, the conscience itself. Confession was one of the most powerful tools of the church. By requiring every believer to confess sins to a priest, the institution gained insight into the private fears, desires, and weaknesses of the people it governed. During confession, a villager might reveal disputes with neighbors, doubts about authority, violations of church law, or thoughts considered sinful. The priest, viewed as a mediator between humanity and God, advised penance and forgiveness, but also reinforced obedience. The act of confessing created psychological dependence. A person's spiritual worthiness was assessed by an authority figure who heard their innermost thoughts. The result was a culture where guilt, shame, and redemption flowed through clerical hands. But confession was not the only practice shaping the inner world. Entire communities were guided by rituals that defined moral order. The medieval church filled villages and towns with constant ritual activity. Saints' processions, feasts, fasts, blessings of fields, and public ceremonies. These events were not merely celebrations. They were demonstrations of communal submission to divine authority. Participation was expected, absence drew suspicion. The sight of monks carrying relics, the sound of chanting, and the solemn march through narrow streets reminded everyone that the sacred permeated daily life. Rituals shaped identity, creating unity through shared belief and reinforcing the idea that salvation could only be found through the church. These ceremonies also prepared the ground for something far more intense moments when fear was used to restore order. The greatest threat to church authority was not war or famine. It was the spread of ideas that challenged doctrine. Heresy, defined as any belief contrary to church teaching, was punished with brutal severity. The medieval Inquisition was formed to investigate, interrogate, and eliminate dissent. Confessions could be extracted through intimidation or punishment. Accusations spread quickly, and even the hint of forbidden belief could bring a person before inquisitors. The psychological impact was profound. People learned to silence doubt, mistrust unconventional ideas, and distance themselves from anyone who questioned the church. Survival depended on conformity, and suspicion became a social weapon. But heresy was not the only fear lurking in medieval imagination. In a world where disease, famine, and misfortune struck without warning, the church offered supernatural explanations. Demons were believed to roam the earth, whispering temptations and corrupting the faithful. Misfortune might be interpreted as divine warning or punishment. Priests stood between humanity and unseen forces, performing blessings, exorcisms, and protective rites. Fear of witchcraft and demonic influence placed the church as the ultimate shield against evil. This worldview bound communities to the clergy, who claimed the unique ability to interpret God's will and dispel darkness. While supernatural fear strengthened spiritual control, the church also held immense political power. No ruler in medieval Europe could govern effectively without the church's approval. Kings and nobles sought coronation by bishops to legitimize their authority. The church could bless a king's rule or undermine it. Excommunication, the severing of a person from the sacraments, was one of the most feared penalties in the medieval world. A ruler cut off from the church risked rebellion, as subjects believed that obeying him would endanger their own souls. By holding the keys to both earthly legitimacy and eternal salvation, the church acted as an invisible monarch above all others. This political supremacy was mirrored in the physical landscape. The architecture of medieval Europe reflected ecclesiastical dominance. Cathedrals towered above towns, monasteries dotted the countryside, and shrines lined major roads. These structures were not mere buildings, they were symbols of power visible from miles away. A traveler's entire journey might be guided by abbeys offering shelter or by churches marking every village. Even personal identity was tied to the church. Names were chosen for saints, holidays defined seasons, and moral codes shaped interpersonal behavior. To be medieval was to be shaped, watched, guided, and judged by the church. Its presence was a constant force, earthly and divine. And now we reach the final reflection, what this immense power reveals about human nature. The medieval church governed not only laws and land, but time, knowledge, morality, and the deepest corners of the human mind. It offered comfort in a harsh world, yet ruled through fear as much as through hope. Its authority shows how deeply people seek meaning, order, and protection, especially in eras of uncertainty. But it also reveals how easily these desires can be shaped, guided, and manipulated by institutions claiming divine purpose. As the bells faded across stone villages each evening, they carried not only prayer, but the echo of a power that shaped centuries and the hearts of all who lived under its shadow.